seated. I invite you now to join with me in a moment of prayer. Center us in your loving presence this day, O God. Help us listen for your encouraging and inspiring word for us in the story of Palm Sunday. And may we open ourselves to transformation as we take this journey with Jesus into Jerusalem and into this Holy Week. Amen. During our Lenten sermon series this year, we have been considering the countercultural values Jesus embodied and how we might embody them too. We've focused on practicing compassion and a willingness to be agents of God's healing love, on having the courage to stand up for others and for justice and grace and mercy in the process, and on living truthfully with integrity. And today we conclude with the practice of humility. And this is going to be the best sermon on humility you've ever heard. You know, I couldn't resist. Palm Sunday is one of those threshold days that moves us into this Holy Week and into these final days of our Lenten journey. Once again, we find ourselves on that familiar road and that familiar story we've heard many times before, as we go alongside Jesus, who is riding on a borrowed donkey, his disciples walking to, and the amassing crowds preparing the ways for him by laying down their cloaks and their branches and joining the processional as they travel down from the Mount of Olives and into the heart of Jerusalem. I know some of us have walked that road. If you've traveled there and walked the road from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, raise your hand. I think a few of us have, yeah. Close your eyes and imagine that story for a minute. There were peasants and pilgrims, locals and travelers, all there in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover and to remember their ancestors' liberation from Pharaoh's Egypt. The population swelled and the city buzzed with activity. Hosanna, save us, they yelled, crying out for freedom once again as their ancestors did before them. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. This is more than an impromptu parade. It's a sort of protest march. And it's also an intentional enactment by Jesus and his disciples of the vision of the prophet Zechariah, who said, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." It's likely that on that same day, on the other side of town, Pontius Pilate was having a parade of his own, riding into town on his war horse, surrounded by Roman soldiers riding and walking alongside him, armed with spears and swords. He traveled from his villa by the sea into Jerusalem every year in order to monitor the crowds. Passover was prone to uprising and demonstrations, and Rome kept a close eye on the situation. The contrasts are stark when we think about this. A donkey, a war horse. A crowd of peasants and disciples, Roman soldiers. Cloaks and leafy branches, spears and swords. Humble Jesus, pompous Pilate. Rome relied on violence and demonstrations of military might to maintain its power and control, and its dominion over its vast empire and the various territories it occupied. Pilate had a reputation of brutality too. We know this not only because the Judeans didn't like him, but some of his own contemporary Romans wrote about his viciousness too. You know, such a system of empire, such a system of autocracy fosters hubris, I think. So it's not really surprising to me that Pilate and others like him were known to be pompous bullies. Anything less than total commitment to the ways of the empire was seen as weakness, lack of ambition, and inadequate leadership. Too much leniency, and you could be leaving the door open for an uprising. So better to overcompensate. That's the world Jesus lived in. He knew Rome well. He knew the risks. And yet, in spite of all of that, he courageously chose that day to publicly embody an alternative vision, one of peace and joy, one of community that invited people in, one of humility. Hubris or humility, the way of empire or the way of Jesus. Jesus' humility was countercultural. Actually, I think humility has been countercultural through much of human history. And it still is today. We see it all the time. Pomposity gets press. Dogmatic attempts at domination are sugar-coated and branded as strong leadership. Angry social media rants get amplified all the time. Hubris is still rewarded in our culture with attention. And it can be a challenge sometimes, and it takes courage to live into the humble way of Jesus in such a climate. But there are others, of course, who have followed in the way of Jesus throughout history, and we can take some inspiration and encouragement from them. Saint Francis did this in the midst of warring Italian city-states and church leaders who caught up in the fray. Celtic Christians, which some of us have been studying this spring, did this despite pressures to conform to state religion and despite the colonization of their homelands. Civil rights leaders in our own country have modeled calm and steady, peaceful resistance in the face of violent and systemic racism. And there are many more who have done the same, both historically and in our contemporary environment. As we consider what humility might look for us in our own lives, I do think it's also important to note what humility is not. Humility is not a lack of self-worth. Humility is not laying down like a doormat that others can walk all over. Humility is not avoiding ever speaking your mind because your ideas might be different and might challenge someone else. And humility is definitely not the oppressive silencing of others. Instead, humility is a choice we make for ourselves. And I think true and healthy humility is made possible when we are grounded, rooted, and centered in what is most true and what is most important. And for us as people of faith who are doing our best to follow Jesus, we are called to place our trust in God's love for us and to embody God's love for all creation. When we think about it this way, faith itself can be an intentional act of humility. It's an act of deference to that which is bigger than ourselves. Being open to the wonder and mystery of God, being open to the movement of the Spirit, being open to God's invitation into relationship with all life. All of this invites a posture of humility rather than hubris. And as we know, when religion lacks humility, it can become dogmatic, closed-minded, exclusive, lacking in awe and surprise, overly concerned with control rather than relationship, and frankly, kind of boring. I don't think that's the kind of relational religion that Jesus modeled for us. Actually, I think relationality has a lot to do with it. How we interact with one another is an expression of who we are and what is most important to us. So to the extent it's possible, we can intentionally choose humility in our interactions with one another. And yes, relationships go both ways, of course. We can only act for ourselves and hope that there's some reciprocity. But it seems to me that over and over throughout history, while hubris has tended to put up barriers between people, humility has the potential to bring us closer together and deeper into relationship with one another. Instead of competition and control and hierarchy, the path of humility can lead us towards collaboration, connection, creativity, community. Instead of posturing and seeking power, the path of humility leads us towards service and care, compassion, looking for, seeing, and meeting the needs of others. Like Mila was talking about, being the hands and feet of Christ in this world. Instead of thinking we all know it all already, the path of humility can lead us into new learning and new growth. Instead of falling into patterns of exclusion, circling the wagons, othering, scapegoating, the path of humility leads us into openness to others, relationships with those whose identities and experiences differ from our own, and more just and peaceful ways of living together on this planet we all call home. I had the opportunity this week to hear two people speak about their experiences as immigrants living in the United States. I'm not going to tell you a lot of details because I don't want to share their stories for them, but I will say this. They're simply seeking safety. The opportunity to work, contribute to their community, have a good life. They modeled humility and courage in sharing their stories. I believe that if we are to find a more just, compassionate way to be together, we have to listen to one another. We have to honor one another with the respect and dignity that everybody deserves. We have to open ourselves up to learn from other people's experiences. And we have to work together rather than working against each other. I think a posture of humility invites us to serve one another. And let's dare to think about it. Think about how a more widespread posture of humility and service could change the global economy, could confront widespread poverty, could shift the tide of the political landscape in the United States and across the world. How might a posture of humility and service help us prioritize the ways in which we employ our ever-changing technological advances and aid us in the pursuit of science to address our urgent environmental concerns? I realize that sometimes hopeful and imaginative visions for our collective future feel impossible, feel worlds away from where we are and the world we're living in. Jesus and his followers felt that too. They knew that experience. It's human. But as I was thinking about this, it struck me that perhaps hopelessness is itself a kind of hubris. Who are we to say that anything is impossible with God? And then my mind went back to Mary and her Magnificat, that song she sang when she learned that she would be the mother of Jesus, and she talked about how nothing is impossible with God. So perhaps when we find ourselves in places of negativity, the path of humility and service can lead us back to hope, back to openness to see what new life may be waiting around the corner, and back to joy. You know, joy itself is a kind of resistance to pompousness and powerful. It diffuses some of the power. Pilate and the Romans may have had control over most aspects of the lives of those in the crowd that day with Jesus, but they couldn't control their joy. They couldn't control their passion in that moment. Their songs of liberation rang out loud and clear anyway. They waved their branches joyfully and laid them down on the ground lovingly, preparing the way for Jesus anyway. And they found joy in solidarity and community with one another, in spite of the real fears they faced and the reality of occupation that they endured. The path of humility is one of openness. Openness to joy, openness to love, openness to the Spirit's leading, and back to one another. According to the Gospel of John, on the last night that Jesus gathered with his disciples, he modeled humility for them in a new way by taking on the role of a servant and washing their feet. As their teacher and leader and friend, he taught them by example one last time, which he'd been teaching them all along, of course, but one last time, what love, humility, compassion, care, and service look like. It was a simple thing, really. It might have been a slightly awkward thing for some of them. And if you read the story, Peter made it kind of awkward by refusing at first and then saying, well, if you're going to wash my feet, then how about my hands and my head too? And Jesus had to be kind of like, Peter, you already took a bath. We're good. But you know, that experience stuck with them, I'm sure. It's a lesson and a memory that they would carry with them and that they would pay forward to others. All of us are called to serve in such a way, to serve with love, to serve with compassion, to serve with tenderness and kindness, and to serve with humility. That's the way of Jesus. That's the way we are called to follow. And so as we follow in the humble way of Jesus with joy and love, peace and hope, let us continue to be open to the journey, open to the companions that we may find along the way, those we've been walking with and those who are just joining the crowd for the first time. Let us be open to new destinations and new experiences, new stories and new adventures. And let us always be open to the possibility of new life springing up and waiting just around the corner. Amen.